At 10:30. First, it's time to join Andrew Marr.
Morning. All the way through this wretched pandemic, and we've been living with it for almost exactly a year now, we have understood that this virus has no nationality. What happens in Britain doesn't stay in Britain. What happens abroad doesn't stay there either. Week by week, rightly, we've been looking in detail at the pandemic here at home. But this week, we just have to look further. The new wave of infections on the European continent, the increasingly difficult vaccine rivalry between the UK and Brussels, and threats to our summer holidays abroad. Today, our theme is simple. Nothing is merely local anymore. And so this morning I'll be talking to both sides of the vaccine divide, from Brussels to the EU Commissioner Mairead McGuinness, and here in London to Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, about that and the imminent defence review. He is giving himself the option to buy another 80 nuclear missiles. Simple question, what are they for? I'll also be talking to the Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy and to Dr. Mary Ramsey of Public Health England. Now that more than half of us have had the jab, what does that mean for summer holidays and other freedoms? Reviewing the news, Lucy Fisher, Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Telegraph, and our own political editor Laura Kuenssberg, who's completed an in-depth study of the government's performance during the pandemic. Busy doesn't really cover it. Let's crack on with the news, read for us this morning by Chris Mason.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. The UK has passed a major milestone in the coronavirus rollout. More than half of all adults have now received their first jab of vaccine. The Health Secretary has called it a phenomenal achievement, but it comes amid rising cases in parts of Europe, with some experts warning that summer holidays abroad are unlikely to happen. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says it's too early to tell when foreign travel will resume. Meanwhile, the boss of the Australian airline Qantas has said that having a coronavirus vaccine could be a requirement if we want to visit some countries. Alan Joyce warned that a number of governments are looking at introducing mandatory vaccinations for all international travellers as part of a plan to revive the aviation industry. Demand for flights has fallen by 75% as a result of the pandemic. Mr Joyce told the BBC it's about keeping people safe. More than 30 people have been arrested following anti-lockdown demonstrations in London. Crowds marched from Hyde Park to Westminster after MPs urged the government to allow peaceful protests during lockdown. Scotland Yard said a number of officers were assaulted, some were attacked with bottles. It's census day today in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. All households are obliged to provide background details for every adult and child. The Once in a Decade Count provides useful information on UK society for the government and other organisations providing key services. The census in Scotland has been delayed until next year. And at a time when there are restrictions on travel for most of us, Wales has found itself welcoming an unexpected visitor. A giant walrus has been spotted in Pembrokeshire, thousands of miles from its home in the Arctic Circle. It's thought the animal may have been the same one that was spotted off the coast of Ireland last week. Biologists believe there is a chance it fell asleep on an iceberg and was then carried south. That is all for me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks, Chris. And now to the front pages as ever. I mentioned this imminent vaccine war. The Mail on Sunday is very excited about that. EU loses plot on vaccine, it says, and discusses that. The Sunday Express, similarly, protect our freedoms. That's really about Tory MPs telling Boris Johnson to tear up all the rules and promise to do so as we leave the restrictions behind. The Observer has a story about sex abuse claims against Metropolitan Police officers, and again, don't extend COVID curbs. Tories warn Prime Minister. The Sunday Telegraph, as I said, there was a big defence review coming up this week, and it's got a story about the SAS. We'll be discussing that later on as well with Lucy Fisher. And the Sunday Times has a rather interesting analysis here of the hereditary peers in the House of Lords. Now, this is, of course, something we've known about for a long time, but the way they lay it out is quite interesting. They say they claim £47 million in expenses. Their average age is 71. How many hereditary peers went to Eton? 46%, rather low, I would have thought. And of course, because of male primogeniture, a rule which the royal family has got rid of, there are no women amongst them. And this is really the beginning, you can tell, of a campaign against the hereditary element in the House of Lords. Now, before I turn to the papers in detail, COVID Confidential, Laura Kuenssberg's fascinating report takes you into the rooms where key government decisions were made during the pandemic, and it's available now as a long read on the BBC News website, as a film on the iPlayer and as a podcast on BBC Sounds. Laura, very interesting piece of work. It's taken you a long time. You must have had PTSD looking back at all those events over the year, I would imagine. Short question, where is the Prime Minister, in your judgment, most vulnerable? Is it the well-rehearsed and well-understood slight delays in clamping down right at the beginning of the pandemic, or what happened in September?
Well, Andrew, a lot has been written and argued about, hasn't it, at that scramble at the beginning in March this time last year, and whether or not the government took too long to really realise that the nature of the pandemic was so serious that it wouldn't act like flu, for example. But I think, and in our reporting of this week, that actually where there was more trouble and where there's been more angst actually in government over the last year is what many people still around in government see as a real missed opportunity in September. One of the things that really sticks in my head is that an official said to me, by then we saw that the data was screaming out as cases started to tick up and up. But all through that month, the Prime Minister, according to multiple people I've spoken to, was really, really reluctant to look at toughening restrictions again. And there were repeated attempts by officials, including some cabinet ministers who were very unhappy about this, to try to get him to crank the restrictions back up again. But that reluctance was very, very notable. And I think that for many people, even when you talk to them about it, you can hear in their voices there's a lot of regret and a lot of anger about what was done or not done then. Important to say, though, that it was a very, very difficult dilemma for the government. And some cabinet ministers involved in the decision say, look, there wasn't a slam dunk recommendation because they were trying also to protect other forms of health and also to protect the economy too.
Of course, and according to the Resolution Foundation, 27,000 people died after those events. How worried should the Prime Minister be about the re-emergence of Dominic Cummings in the House of Commons Select Committee and saying he's very keen to be asked about all of this in public?
Well, we got a little flavour of the kinds of things that the Prime Minister is always controversial, but very much former advisor might be willing to say when he appeared in front of MPs this week. He already took some pretty significant potshots at the Department of Health, saying it was a smoking ruin after how it tried to grapple with PPE. And he made it very public that he's only too happy to come forward with his evidence about the rest of the handling of the pandemic later next month. And I think that both he and other people, I think, involved would be really quite willing to give their side of the story. But when you talk to people who were involved in making the decisions, what came back to me, though, time and time again, was the real kind of agony of the dilemmas. You know, you very often in politics hear people say, oh, well, it's not a matter of life and death. It's just a decision. It's just politics. We'll just have to kind of do what we can. You've got to plump for a decision. This felt very, very different all the way through. And one of the conversations I had that really sticks in my mind is the senior minister said to me, we just have to accept that it was perfectly possible to have been wrong. And I could almost tell talking to them that they really sort of carry that burden with them. I think acknowledging that some things did go wrong and some mistakes really were made. But these decisions were, you know, nearly impossible and also so strange. One of the other things that really sticks in my mind is an official who was in the room in some of these conversations said at the very beginning, they said, I went away and Googled whether or not they shut the schools during the war. You know, the strangeness and the scramble of the decisions that they had to make are really, really profound. And, you know, this time last year, where are we, the 21st of March, none of us had an idea of how this was going to pan out. It's been
It has been an astonishing year, hasn't it? Yeah. It has. Let's move, Lucy Fisher, to what's on Boris Johnson's inbox this morning, because the front page of the Mail on Sunday is focusing on the vaccine war coming with the EU, and certainly what Ursula von der Leyen has been saying yesterday about the possibility of blocking vaccine exports to the UK must have a lot of people in Whitehall quite seriously worried.
Well, that's right. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, has pointed out that AstraZeneca has only fulfilled a third of the 90 million doses the EU expected to receive in the first quarter of this year, while it's fulfilled all its obligations to the UK. UK officials quite rightly pointing out in that Mail on Sunday story that, of course, the British government, paid to develop the vaccine and the production facilities, and arguing that Britain has had better contracts with the pharmaceutical giant in order to make sure they are delivered. But we're scaling up now for a pretty tense week with the EU. This is a subject that's going to be discussed at the European Council summit on Thursday. It's worth noting that there isn't a consensus in the bloc about how to treat this threat of a blockade, what the Mail on Sunday calls holding doses hostage from the UK, while France and Germany appear to be backing the European Commission President's threat. Boris Johnson does seem to have done a good job in recruiting allies in Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, all of whom are much more reluctant, it seems, to engage in this kind of trade war.
Very, very interesting. Now, of course, for all those people, Laura, who are not that interested in the details of Brussels politics, but really care about their summer holidays, the Sun has gone to town with Summer Holiday, it says.
They have, and these are the practical implications of not just this extraordinary diplomatic vaccine argument, but also the lopsided nature of what's happening with the pandemic on different sides of the channel right now. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, yesterday sort of gave a real sort of heavy cautionary note about the possibility of people being able to jump on planes to go on holiday this year, despite the vaccine success in this country. We should also remember it's not just about people who want to go on holiday, it's also people who've been in the UK and might have relatives abroad who may not have been able to see them for months and months and months. But it's certainly one side effect of the very, very slow rollout of the vaccine on continental Europe is I think the government's got a very, very big question over whether or not it would be wise to allow summer travel to go ahead. And it's also a reminder that although we have that detailed roadmap, that gradual unlocking of the country's doors and reopening the economy again, there are several really big issues that aren't yet resolved. One of them is foreign travel. One of them is the nature of the workplace. And there are big decisions that ministers still have to take beyond the plans that they've already set out in terms of opening up pubs and when people can mercifully go to a haircut before too long.
And Lucy, the Express in particular, has focused on the anger and despair of some Tory MPs about these restrictions and their suspicion that they're going to be kept in place for longer than they're being told at the moment. But I think in particular, we should remember that this is not just a British emotion. All across the continent of Europe, people are chafing at the restrictions they've lived under for so long. People have had enough. And the Observer has a very interesting sort of double-page spread, including about the Germans in revolt.
Well, that's right. Germany, like much of the continent, is now in the sort of early stages of a third wave of coronavirus. Germany's had 5 months now of rolling restrictions. Angela Merkel is due to meet with regional leaders tomorrow in what many German citizens had hoped would be a decision to ease restrictions. Instead, it sounds like they're going to be tightened and extended. And what you can read in the Observer today is lots of ordinary citizens just complaining about how boring and dull and exhausted they are. And I think that's a sentiment many people in Britain share.
Absolutely.
It's 1 year anniversary of the first lockdown. And I think while at the beginning of the pandemic, there was that sense that a climate of fear prevailed, that has slowly given way to just weary exhaustion.
We have had it up to here, Lucy. Laura, very interesting story on the front page of the Sunday Times about David Cameron lobbying Rishi Sunak on behalf of a financial services company subsequently gone bust, in which he had a lot of options and a lot of money invested.
That's right. This is a tricky episode of what they did next. Now, David Cameron popped up actually in the Financial Times a few days ago, who'd done some excellent digging on his involvement in a company called Greensill Capital that he was working for. Now, Greensill was a lender, a big bank that did some unusual things that collapsed. But what emerged was that he had been involved in conversations trying to get them access to the government's COVID emergency loans. Remember those billions and billions of pounds that the Treasury has unleashed to try to prop up the economy over the last year. And the Sunday Times has moved that on with some new detail this morning, suggesting that David Cameron was even texting Rishi Sunak personally about this. Of course, the implication there is that's not exactly going through the normal regular channels. David Cameron was contacted for comments and didn't go to the Sunday Times, but I'd be surprised if there weren't questions about this in Parliament this week.
Not a good look. We're almost out of time. Lucy, could I ask you very, very quickly about the Sunday Telegraph story, your own paper, on the SAS? It's a very big week for defence, isn't it?
It's a very big week for defence. The SAS, the Chief of the General Staff, the Head of the Army, saying that they will be taking more of an active role against hostile states. I think the restructuring of some of the forces is of a lot of interest to everyone that follows this debate, but particularly tomorrow when Ben Wallace unveils the Defence Command paper, a lot of questions will be around the balance of investment and, crucially, what might be cut from the armed forces. We know that there's going to be fewer tanks upgraded, a lot of speculation about fewer jets for the RAF. And I think one of the biggest questions is if he follows through on the decision to cut 10,000 personnel from the previous 82,000 minimum target for the Army.
All right. Thanks both very much. A top news team for old Marr this morning. Thank you very much indeed. Now then, the weather. Most of us have had a fairly brisk reminder this week that spring in Britain isn't necessarily a warm and soothing season. As we look forward to the beginning of the end of some restrictions this Easter, what will the weather be doing? Over to Matt Taylor in the weather studio. Matt.
Hi there, Andrew. Well, we've got another spring veritable feast coming this week. We start dry. That's certainly the case today. Most places continue with the dry theme we've seen already this weekend. Fair bit of cloud to the northwest of Scotland. Cloud taking longer towards the southwest to thin and break. But for most, actually a brighter day than yesterday. The best of the sunshine, southern Scotland, northwest England. But winds generally coming from a northerly direction. It's going to be cooler than it was yesterday for some spots, chiefly down those eastern coasts where we saw temperatures into the teens. Could only be 7 or 8 degrees again through parts of East Anglia with that northerly wind. But otherwise, temperatures around where we should be for the time of year. Then as we go into this evening and overnight, if you've been out planting this weekend, be wary. There will be a frost around through parts of Scotland, England and Wales especially. Clear skies for any length of time will drop temperatures away from the towns and cities below freezing. A few mist and fog patches around too. But for tomorrow, it looks like it's going to be another predominantly dry day for the vast majority. Best of sunny breaks across England and Wales. More cloud for Scotland, Northern Ireland. Maybe 1 or 2 showers in the west too, with a strengthening breeze and temperatures lifting a little bit relative to today. But as for the rest of the week, temperatures will drop later in the week. But it's going to be a week where we see the return of wind and rain to the north and west. Most though in the south and east, Andrew, will continue to stay dry. Back to you.
Good. France and Poland have introduced new lockdown measures amid a surge in infections across much of continental Europe. And despite assurances from the European medicines regulator about the safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine, some countries are still reluctant to use it. All the same, the European Commission is once again threatening to block the export of vaccines to countries like Britain. Mairead McGuinness is a European Commissioner and former Vice President of the European Parliament. Commissioner, can I ask you, is the EU seriously going to try to stop vaccines being exported to Britain?
Well, good morning, Andrew. I think it's quite interesting, the reaction to facts that were put on the table this week, because the European Union, as I heard from your contributors, are being accused of vaccine nationalism. In fact, we could be accused of vaccine internationalism because we have exported to 31 countries, including the United Kingdom. And I think what's terribly important this week, as you say, there is an increase in infections across Europe, alarming for everybody. But the leaders will meet this week and they will make an assessment of the current situation about the rollout of vaccines and perhaps make decisions. But as the President of the Commission said herself, everything is on the table, but there is no decision. It was really important that we found out what was happening in relation to vaccine production. I think we are the first bloc, if you like, to collect this information. And, you know, the world is going to live with COVID, unfortunately, for much longer than this year, sure, as I hear the experts speaking. Yeah. So we do need to have a global view of where vaccines are being produced and, indeed, the actual supply chain of the various raw materials that go into the vaccine. So I think we have put everything on the table. We've been open and transparent, and we invite other stakeholders globally to do the same.
But you haven't ruled out blocking the vaccines going into Britain. Your boss, Ursula von der Leyen, said yesterday, we have the option of banning a planned export. That's the message to AstraZeneca. So it could happen.
Well, I think the AstraZeneca saga is well told at this stage and is hugely disappointing. And European citizens are growing angry and upset at the fact that the vaccine rollout has not happened as rapidly as we had anticipated. Both the EU and the UK have contracts with AstraZeneca. And my understanding is that the company is supplying the UK, but not the European Union. We are supplying, the UK with other vaccines. So I think this is about just openness and transparency and addressing citizens' concerns. Right. It's about nothing else. And this idea of wars and, nationalism, I really will want to stress and take that off the table. Europe has been international in its approach on vaccines. We are also one of the biggest donors to COVAX so that the developed world can also get access to vaccines. And I think your introduction to this item speaks of a truth that the world will not be safe unless everyone is safe. And look, it's wonderful to see people getting vaccinated in my own member state, in the UK. I mean, it really is fantastic. Sure. It lifts our spirits. But we need to know what our production capacity is. We will be ramping up production within the European Union for the medium and long term, because I think if this pandemic passes, there will be others.
I'm sorry, but you are not ruling out banning the export of vaccines to the UK. You yourself mentioned the components of vaccines. The danger in this, surely, is that the UK then bans some of the lipids and ingredients for instance, the Pfizer vaccine. What would be the impact on the health of EU citizens if that happened?
Well, Andrew, you're asking me to make a decision that is not for me to make. It is a decision of the leaders of the European Union who meet on Thursday who will decide what to do. And you're absolutely right. I've made the same point, that we are interconnected here. And Europe has been incredibly open when it comes to exports. Over 40 million vaccines have been exported. So 1 in 4 or more have been exported from the European Union's production sites. So we didn't engage in any nationalism. We've been international. So I really think that's an important part. Equally important is to listen to the World Health Organization, and maybe after this, putting facts on the table, other stakeholders could do the same. And I think that would be a great service to citizens who are very anxious at the moment.
One of the things that strikes a lot of people in the UK is that inside the EU there are something like 15 million unused doses of vaccines sitting in warehouses and in fridges. And people wonder why, given that you can't simply use those vaccines. Sir John Bell, who's a very eminent scientist at Oxford, says that the EU policy, given the surge in cases around the EU, given the increase in variants, is, in his words, crackers.
Well, I've read those comments, and look, frankly, none of us have had a great COVID. I think all of us should put our hands up and say we were not prepared for this global pandemic. We did not do our best at the beginning, but we are doing our best now to protect our citizens. And I think that's exactly where Europe is focused on, is on protecting our citizens. And once everyone is protected, we are safe. So I think that we all need to, if you like, calm down, look very, if you like, dispassionately at the situation around the raw materials for vaccines, around where they're produced and how we might ramp up that production. But more importantly, and I think lots of experts are saying this, that we have to prepare for a potential other variant, because we know that the UK variant has spread widely and is harder to actually, if you like, treat, but also it causes more rapid transmission. We have to be prepared for what, if you like, the what if another variant arises that is more difficult and we need another vaccine. So look, out of all of this discussion, controversy and, opinion, I think we have to, if you like, let wiser counsel prevail here. But it is interesting how when facts are put on the table, different opinions are formed on those facts. And everyone is entitled to their opinion, but not their own facts. We have put our facts clearly on the table.
Well, that's a very, very good point to make, which leads me to President Macron, who has said some very inflammatory things about the AstraZeneca vaccine in particular. Questioning its efficacy. You have a real problem inside the EU of what's called vaccine hesitancy, people being reluctant to take, in particular, the AstraZeneca vaccine. Do you think those comments were irresponsible?
Look, I actually don't agree with you that there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy. It was interesting before vaccines became available. A lot of people were hesitant. But when the vaccine was rolled out and we saw its efficacy, people then wanted to be vaccinated. I don't speak for any leader of the European Union. I think they speak very well for themselves.
I'm
but
sorry,
we
Commissioner,
all know that vaccination works. and we need to persuade everyone to be vaccinated so that everyone is safe.
Could I just jump in for a second? Because there was a poll conducted in March, the middle of this month, by LABE, suggesting that only 20% of the French people trusted the AstraZeneca vaccine. And that followed their president saying, and I quote, "Everything points to thinking it is quasi-ineffective on people older than 65. And I could suggest to you those two facts could be connected.
Yeah, but you're fighting a battle that we don't need to fight here, because the European Medicines Agency has absolutely said with great clarity this week that the AstraZeneca vaccine works, and we are now rolling it out across the member states. Of course, we are not, as in the Commission, responsible for how member states roll out vaccines. That is the responsibility of the member states. But I know from the member state I come from, yesterday appointments were being made, people were coming in, getting the AstraZeneca vaccine, and very happy to do that. I mean, I think in all of the minutiae of some of these conversations, we're forgetting the big picture here, that the world has literally been stopped turning in the last year, and that all of the things we took for granted as citizens, free movement, summer holidays, I mean, what are they? Or a meal out, or being able to visit my family. All of these things have been literally destroyed because of an invisible virus. And we were not ready for it, and I say that globally as opposed to Europe. And we have learnt the hard lesson. We need to invest both in public health, in pharmaceutical supply chains. It's also interesting, and I looked at the UK government's website this morning, that over 100 pharmaceutical products cannot be exported from the United Kingdom. And one could describe that perhaps as vaccine nationalism, but obviously it's the United Kingdom wanting to have treatments for its own citizens. So I think we have to be very careful of accusations on one side or the other. Europe has its facts on the table, and again we invite others to do the same.
We all have to lower the temperature, and in that context, let me ask you about the Northern Ireland Protocol, where the British government wants to extend the grace period by 6 months to help consumers in Northern Ireland. And that would allow new arrangements to be put in place. And in response to that, the EU Commission is taking the British government to court. Is that not a disproportionate and aggressive response?
I think you're missing an important piece of the jigsaw, Andrew, if I may say so. The United Kingdom took a decision by itself to extend deadlines to at least October of this year. No discussion, no phone call to my colleague, Vice President Šefčovič, who's responsible for all of this. So really heads did turn. We are obliged to respond. When an international treaty is not complied with, we have to respond legally in the only way we know possible. But we're also aware that we have to discuss the details and work to solutions. And if I may say, the withdrawal agreement, including the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, and I know it personally and passionately, you know, it was difficult to negotiate. Boris Johnson signed it and sealed it, but he hasn't delivered on it. And I think there needs to be some honesty around what was signed up to. Europe was very clear, and we understand that Boris Johnson was also aware and clear of the consequences. However, commentary since the signing has suggested otherwise, including comments from the Northern Ireland Secretary. So look, we're in a difficult place, but we are equal partners, and we will have to sit down, hopefully, as you suggest, reduce the temperature and find solutions, because business knows no borders. The business people in Northern Ireland want a solution, and in fact there was time last year to find that solution, but it wasn't used. We need to know that there will be a roadmap, and the time that the UK has unilaterally taken will be used to change the situation and prepare for the new reality.
So this is really a question about trust. Your old colleague and friend Simon Coveney has said the problem is that the EU simply cannot trust the British government at the moment. Now, in that context, is this issue, and indeed the vaccine argument, going to bleed over into your responsibility, which is financial services, and mean that it's harder to get a deal about the City of London's future working inside the EU going forward? There's a memorandum of understanding meant to be coming out later this week. Has the political atmosphere of mistrust and difficulty at the moment started to infect that?
Well, can I just say I have a very cool head and a warm heart, and I know that we are duty bound to have a memorandum of understanding with the United Kingdom, and there's good news on that front. Our services are working really well together. There's a meeting tomorrow, and I'm very hopeful that we will have a memorandum of understanding agreed. And notwithstanding all of those other components, I certainly do not put them into the one basket and therefore come out with a different point of view. My responsibility in my role is financial stability. We took decisions at the end of last year, equivalence decisions with the United Kingdom to ensure financial stability. But the United Kingdom chose very deliberately to leave the single market, and therefore UK firms lost all of their passporting rights in the European Union. And I will be clear on two things. One is we will be sitting down with the United Kingdom to work through some of the areas that need to be dealt with, but we will not be recreating the conditions of the single market for the United Kingdom because the UK chose to leave. And I know the City of London in the beginning was concerned about that. So what I deal with are the realities on the ground now. But in terms of action, the first phase is going well, the memorandum. I would say, though, your point is reasonable insofar as between vaccines, Brexit and etc. You could say that it's a difficult time, but we're all involved in doing the right thing for our citizens, and that's what I intend to do.
Mairead McGuinness, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, listening to that in our studio in Salford is the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Lisa Nandy, it's clear that the EU threat to block vaccines coming into the UK is still live. If that happens, how should the UK respond?
Well, I think the President of the European Commission's comments were deeply, deeply unhelpful. I think that it was right, listening to the Commissioner just now, that we should try to calm down these tensions. We've seen throughout this process that we do better when we work together, that if we don't defeat the virus everywhere, we're not going to defeat it anywhere. And there are new strains of the virus that are currently emerging, the South African variant, which scientists are particularly worried about, that is starting to gain traction in France, that we need to be very mindful of. We may not be out of the woods with COVID yet, and so we've got to work together. That means we need to calm down these tensions. Blockades are really unhelpful. I would urge the European Commission to calm down the language, cool the rhetoric, and let's try and work together to get through this crisis.
One of the crucial components of the Pfizer vaccine is made in Cheshire. If the EU banned the export of vaccines into the UK, would the UK be justified in banning the exports of components back into the EU?
Well, look, this is precisely the tit for tat we don't want to get into. If we do get into that situation, the consequences, not just for the EU, but for the UK and for the world, will be very, very severe. The Commissioner just mentioned COVAX. We've got to start getting the vaccine out, not just to our own citizens, but once we've done that, to the rest of the world as well. There are countries that haven't received a single dose of the vaccination, and when you've got very high rates of infection, you get new strains emerging. This really is a race against time, and we've got to work together to get it done. We just cannot afford to be there.
And Lisa Nandy, you mentioned a moment ago the South African variant passing around France in particular very fast at the moment. Do you think the government should consider banning foreign holidays this summer to the continent of Europe to keep that out of the UK?
Well, I know everyone's desperate to go on holiday, but we've got to proceed with caution. We can't allow the good work that has been done from the vaccine rollout to be unravelled by unlocking too quickly or by failing to secure our borders. We've seen problems with that in the past. I think the government is right to say we should be guided by the science. I've been troubled by the fact that the Prime Minister privately seems to be saying to some of his rebels that he's keen to get this done quickly. We do need to be careful. We do need to be cautious. And, you know, frankly, I haven't booked a foreign holiday for this summer, and I won't be doing so because I don't think we're there yet.
So some really important votes coming up in the House of Commons over the next couple of weeks, including over the coronavirus powers, quite draconian powers that the government has taken for itself during this pandemic. We saw one of the results of that on Clapham Common quite recently. Will the Labour Party be voting to approve the extension of those powers going forward?
Well, look, the existing powers would have allowed the police to allow that demonstration to go ahead if it had gone ahead in a socially distant way. And my understanding is that the organisers had tried to do so, but that the police weren't willing to discuss it.
So will you vote against those powers?
Well, the point I'm making is it's not the powers that are the problem, it's the way in which those powers were used. There are certainly powers on the statute book that haven't been used in the last 12 months. This week we want to have that debate in the Commons about whether it's necessary that they remain on the statute book, but nevertheless what the vote is this week is about the roadmap, about easing the roadmap, is about statutory sick pay, is about the ban on evictions, all measures that we've pushed for. We certainly won't be standing in the way of the government in getting this legislation passed. Coming
to your own brief, as it were, does Labour support the extension of the cap on nuclear weapons by another 80 missiles that the government seems to be keen on? Will you vote for another 80 nuclear weapons?
Well, look, we're absolutely baffled by, as many Tory MPs are as well, about why the government's chosen this moment at the point at which the United States has stepped forward to try to deal with nuclear proliferation, signing a new treaty with Russia, at the point at which we face a growing threat from Iran,
so will
from
you
nuclear
vote against
weapons.
it?
We're absolutely baffled as to why the government has done it. There may be a reason why they've done this.
Yeah.
One of the examples mooted has been that perhaps they need to have 2 nuclear deterrents concurrently. But
will
so
you?
far,
I'm sorry to stop you. Will you vote against it?
I'm sorry. I'm going to answer the question because I think this is a really serious step that potentially threatens the security of our country. So far, the government has not given any reason why it's broken with 50 years of convention and gone against the direction of travel, that reining in nuclear weapons is an important part of our safety and security. Until they can give an explanation to the House of Commons, we won't support them.
So you would vote against it. Let me come to the Hartlepool by-election, the next big political moment in many ways for the Labour Party. Your candidate, Paul Williams, said in 2011, "Do you have a favourite Tory MILF? Mind-blowing dinner table conversation," to which your colleague, the ex-Shadow Attorney General, Shami Chakrabarti, said this: "Completely unacceptable, misogynistic abuse. We need to change that candidate immediately." Do you agree with Shami Chakrabarti?
Well, I absolutely agree with her that it is completely and utterly unacceptable. He was right to apologise, and if he hadn't apologised, frankly, we'd be having a very different conversation on this show this morning. I think it's really important that when we said as a Labour movement that this has to be a watershed moment after the murder of Sarah Everard and the outpouring from women across this country about what everyday sexism has done to our lives, that we prove it. Paul has apologised. He now has to go out and show that when we said this was a watershed moment, we're going to use it. He has a huge platform through the by-election to demonstrate that, and I am absolutely determined that we are going to do that.
So it's fine to be a misogynist as long as you apologise?
No, I don't think it's fine to be a misogynist at all. But I think you need to recognise, Andrew, that we're in a place where a lot of people have got this wrong in the past. But with everything that's happened in the last 2 weeks, that drumbeat of everyday sexism to which women across this country, including me, are forced to live our lives is no longer acceptable. He said he got it wrong. And now what I want to hear from him and from others who've made comments like this is that they're going to get this right in the future, particularly those people who have a public platform. They have to show that they are able to move this debate forward and increase women's safety. We've had appalling comments from many people over the last few years who are still in the public eye, including, as Priti Patel rightly said, the Prime Minister. And what I would say to him and to candidates in the Labour Party and to anyone else who makes comments like this is that this is no longer acceptable. We will not put up with it any longer.
Lisa Nandy, thank you for talking to me. Thanks very much indeed. Dr. Mary Ramsey is Public Health England's head of immunisation. She's absolutely central to the vaccine rollout, and there's been such a success. But with a dip in supply coming, even before the war of words with the EU, will that have an impact on the pace of the programme and how quickly we get out of lockdown? I spoke to her just before we came on air, and I asked her if the EU does restrict supply of vaccines to the UK, what impact would that have?
My understanding is that we have contracts in place which will basically mean that that can't happen, and that we have got enough vaccine here to make sure that those first 9 groups get vaccinated by mid-April.
As things stand, how many first doses of the vaccine do you think are going to be going into people's arms during April?
So I think the balance during April is going to shift a bit towards finishing off those first 9 groups, which we've really done very good progress on so far, and then to start the second doses, which have been started already really on the people who got their first doses before Christmas and in early January. So I think the focus during this month will move much more towards second doses.
Will there be any first doses given in April, do you think?
That's my understanding, that we're still planning to do first doses up until mid-April. We're getting first doses into all of those people in the first 9 groups. So that's everybody over 50 and the 2 priority risk groups, the clinically extremely vulnerable and those with other medical conditions.
And of course, lots of people are waiting to get their second dose. If there are constraints on vaccine supply, might we see the mixing of doses going forward?
That's not the current plan because we don't have any data on mixing the two doses together. It's very likely, from first principles, that's not going to be a problem. And there are studies going on now, really, which are looking at people having one dose after the other. And I think there will be some data coming through from those. So if we do get some reassuring data, then that's certainly something we will consider. And it will make, obviously, the rollout logistically easier, even if there aren't supply problems, because you're able to then, obviously, you can go to any of the centres and it doesn't matter which vaccine you've got. So that's certainly something we will consider, but obviously only when we have data to show that there's no safety problems with that.
Absolutely. At the moment, of course, most people under 50 haven't had the vaccine and COVID affects them too. What are the effects on public health of easing all the restrictions while we still have so many people in the country who haven't been vaccinated and amongst whom presumably variants could emerge?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very important that we don't relax too quickly. We know that now that we've vaccinated a large proportion of the most vulnerable groups, if we do get circulation in the community, then the chances of us having a huge number of deaths or hospital admissions are much lower. We've really reduced the risk of that happening. But that doesn't mean that we've prevented the infection spreading. And obviously when infection is spreading, it will pick out anybody who is vulnerable. And some of those people will potentially get serious disease. And even healthy younger people can occasionally get serious disease. So we really don't want that to happen until we're sure that we've got really good levels of protection and as many people protected as possible.
Right now, what do you think is the biggest single risk to the UK vaccine rollout and the easing of restrictions?
I think it's mainly about variants. That's our main concern. I think there's really good evidence that the current vaccines are working effectively against the variants we've got circulating here. We think it's very likely that the vaccines will also work against the more severe forms of disease, even if you do get one of the other variants. But that's an area we're really concentrating on monitoring very, very closely. We've got excellent systems in place in the UK to pick up the emergence of variants, and we will look at all the international evidence as that comes through. If there's any concern about that, then that's obviously our main worry, because that would be potentially undermining the programme so far. But as I said, I think all the experts think that really, even if you do get a variant infection after having been vaccinated, it's far more likely that that will be a milder form of infection and you wouldn't really be at risk of severe disease or death.
Meanwhile, lots of people watching this programme are trying to make decisions of their own about where to go on holiday and when to travel. Do you think they should be prepared now for not travelling to the continent of Europe or perhaps other countries during the summer?
I think everybody just has to wait and see. We really don't know, as I said, the situation changes so quickly. Numbers are going up at the moment in continental Europe, and that's very concerning. Hopefully they will get their vaccine programs up, on track a bit more, and that will bring those down, and they will obviously go into lockdown and other things, and that can change the situation. But obviously, the safest thing is to stay where you are and to avoid anything that increases your risk. And I think it's really too early to say what sort of summer we might be able to experience. The vaccine, if you have had the vaccine, it will protect you, but it doesn't necessarily prevent spread. It doesn't necessarily prevent you potentially passing it on to someone else by having that mild infection. So we really don't want to jeopardise what has been an amazingly successful programme by allowing more circulation of unwelcome strains.
Do you think France should now be on the red list of countries?
There are lots of countries that have better data than others, and at least from France we have really good idea of what's going on, so I think we can make those assessments. But the situation changes obviously all the time, and so naturally we will be looking very, very carefully every week at what's going on internationally and making decisions on the basis of that.
All right, reality check. At the moment, if I look at the government's timetable, on June the 22nd, all restrictions go. Do you really think this summer we could see Wembley Stadium jam-packed with people not wearing masks and families pouring across the continent of Europe on holiday? Is that really going to happen?
I think it's too early to say. I don't think it's going to be quite back to complete normal. What will happen is if we do have mass events happening, they will happen very carefully. They will be monitored very carefully. There will be very clear instructions about the kind of things you can do at those events. And I think the same goes for travel. There will be some kind of advice that will tell you not to be quite what you would normally have done, say, 2 or 3 years ago. So things are going to be different, but there may be a little bit less restriction than perhaps we're fearing at the moment. But it really is a matter of we have to look very carefully at the data before any of these restrictions are lifted.
Of course. So in short, the new normal won't be quite like the old normal. Is it possible that we learn to live with this infection going forward and our daily life simply changes? Would you expect, for instance, mask wearing to go on for a long period of time, some kinds of social distancing to go on for a long period of time?
I think, yes, I think we are talking about quite a long period of time. We may eventually get back to a much more normal situation, but I think people have got used to those lower level restrictions now, and I think people can live with them, and the economy can still go on with those restrictions, with those less severe restrictions in place. So I think certainly for a few years, at least until other parts of the world are as well vaccinated as we are, and the numbers have come down everywhere, that's when we maybe will be able to go very gradually back to a more normal situation.
Dr. Mary Ramsay, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
And my final guest this morning is the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Mr. Wallace, we heard from Mairead McGuinness just now that the threat to ban vaccines from the EU into the UK is still very much on the table at the moment. If that happens, how should we respond?
Well, I think what should happen is that both the European Commission and the United Kingdom should live up to their obligations. You know, the European Union stands for the rule of law. We heard her also say about observing international treaties. It stands for the rule of law, and that means we should all abide by our contracts. We are legally all obliged, both the supplier and the purchaser. And we should, I think the European Commission also recognises that the world's watching. What are the values of the EU which they profess? And, if you're a country around the world and you see this type of language being deployed by the Commission, it will be counterproductive. And what we know about our manufacture of our vaccine, it is a collaborative approach. The AstraZeneca IP was developed in Oxford, parts of the supply chain are in Europe, some of the supply chains in India. And I think, trying to sort of balkanise or build walls around this would only damage both EU citizens and the United Kingdom.
We heard Mary Ramsay a few moments ago talk about the threat of the South African variant and the more protected as well as theirs.
Yeah, look, the grown-up thing is for all of us to pull together to make sure we maximise production opportunities, both for the United Kingdom, but also for our friends and partners around the world.
We could give more vaccines to the EU.
I don't know the actual supply chain right now, the number of vaccines on our shelf, but we could absolutely work together to continue to maximise production. Already, the United Kingdom government is exploring increasing production. We're exploring where else we can grow the supply chain, whether at home or abroad. We're also funding up to £500 million to COVAX, the international community, to make sure we get nearly 1 billion doses out around the world when they are available to countries that are much poorer than us. So the grown-up thing would be for the European Commission and some of the European leaders to not indulge in rhetoric, but to recognise the obligations that we all have, pull together, where can we maximise supply and help roll out that supply.
Do you take their threat seriously?
Well, I think I take any sort of alarmist language seriously. I think that's that is counterproductive. It's counterproductive and it worries my constituents. It worries, no doubt, many constituents across the EU. And I think what we shouldn't forget is, domestically, they are under real pressure. The European Commission came up with a pan-Europe solution that has clearly not delivered the goods to the citizens of Europe. Both local politicians and indeed Commission politicians on the continent will feel that pressure deeply. And I think you're really seeing a response to that. But, fundamentally, we'll all hold each other to our contracts. Making a vaccine is like baking a cake, and we all have different ingredients. And the European Commission will know that. You pointed out the point about Pfizer. They will know that simply, you wouldn't want to cut off your nose to spite your face.
Feeling in your waters, are we going to go on foreign holidays to the continent this summer?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has quite right. It kicked off a task force both on passporting with vaccination but also in travel, and that's going to report in April. And I think it's very, very important that we see not only how pandemic is developing abroad, but also see how we are dealing with it and the vaccinations. I think our number one consideration is that even though the United Kingdom is almost leading the world on vaccination rates, over half the adult population, really important that we don't import new variants and undermine all that hard work.
It sounds to me as if we should not be going on holidays to the continent. If I've turned on my television set this morning crossly to find out whether I should book my foreign holiday now, I'm listening to Ben Wallace. I'm not absolutely sure what his message is.
Well, I haven't booked my holiday. I will wait to see what the response is from those task forces in April. I think it would be premature to do that. It would be potentially risky. We are seeing growing variants, and I think we have done a huge amount of work. The taxpayer, the NHS staff, my constituents who've been in lockdown since September in Preston, and I don't want us to throw that away.
We're seeing 35,000 new infections a day at the moment in France. Could the ban on foreign holidays be extended?
Well, I think we'll play it by ear. Well, let's look at this report, the task force.
So it could be.
Well, no, I'm not going to rule anything in or anything out,
right,
Andrew.
okay.
I think the first thing is we are not going to do anything that puts at risk this national effort to control this pandemic. All the indicators in the right direction at the moment, and let's take it step by step.
Because of the supply issue on vaccines, we know that there's going to be a dip in vaccinations during next month, and we know that people under 50 are not going to be vaccinated. Given that, and given what's going on the continent, is it possible that the government's roadmap of restrictions being lifted could be extended?
Well, I think, first and foremost, let's get to the 29th of March, which is the next stage, and then the 12th of April, before we can talk about the long-term future. The Prime Minister set out a very clear plan all the way to June. I think all of us across the country really, really hope that that is the plan that not only we stick to, but produces the results we want. All of us have been in this lockdown, and it affects us all in all sorts of personal ways, as well as the economy. And so I'm pretty confident at the moment we're in the right direction. Hospital admissions are down. Tragic loss of life is down. The NHS is going to be able to cope at the moment. The vaccine rollout is world leading. Those in the right direction.
Despite all of that, an awful lot of your colleagues on the Tory backbenches in particular are pretty frustrated and cross at the moment and are going to vote against restrictions being extended this week. What should the Prime Minister be saying to them to win them round?
Well, I think he should